So, all right, so we'll move on to our second question of the evening. This question is also from Mr. Matthew Barco. Mr. Barco asks, what would your administration do to promote serious diplomatic efforts attempted before the use of force is authorized both domestically and abroad? So again, the question is, what would your administration do to promote serious diplomatic efforts attempted before the use of force is authorized both domestically and abroad?
I'll be honest here. I think foreign policy is one of my weaker areas. It's one of the things on which I haven't focused as much of my attention in recent years. And so I haven't given this issue as much thought as some of the other things that we might discuss tonight. However, I will say that I think diplomacy is certainly a much better tool than military action. I think that the use of any military force should be a last resort. And as the party agrees, the platform should be only in accordance with just war principles. And so that would mean very, very little military action, if any, would be likely to come about. And so, I mean, I think that the way to ensure that that happens is merely to focus on diplomacy, to be intentional about staffing your administration with people who are serious about diplomacy, who are not hawks by any sense of the word, people who would want to avoid violence as much as I do, avoid sending Americans into harm's way, as well as potentially harming civilians or other people abroad or at home.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. We'll be moving on to our third question of the evening. This question is asked by Ms. Christy Yao, Maryland. And Ms. Yao asks, what is your stance on gun control? And the question is, what is your stance on gun control?
That is a great question, Christy. This is actually something I've been planning to write an essay on. Hope to publish that in the next couple of weeks. It's basically, I think that the reframing of the issue as people who are gun control activists have done in the last several years toward gun safety or reducing gun violence is in some ways the better way to address the issue or to frame the issue than to talk about controlling firearms themselves. I think that we need to look at, I mean, the first problem I have with the current discourse on gun control is the overemphasis on mass shootings and how that gets the attention of the nation through the 24-hour news cycle, mass media. Even though, so mass shootings are undoubtedly a tragedy. Every single one, every single life lost in those is tragic. But we have to understand that mass shootings comprise somewhere around 1% to 3% of all homicides in any given year committed by firearms. And so the problem, if we were to erase mass shootings altogether, then that would mean we only decrease the number of homicides fractionally. So I think that the focus needs to be put away shifted away from mass shootings. And I think the reason that people focus on them so much is that the violence that does occur mostly is concentrated in inner cities among young Black men. And for the average person in the United States who's white, middle class, that is distant from them. They probably live in the suburbs. They don't have to deal with that reality. They don't have multiple people in their lives who have been affected directly by gang violence and other gun violence in the inner cities. And so I think that mass shootings is something that, because it's unpredictable, it can happen anywhere. And so we feel threatened by that. But the reality is it's extremely unlikely that any individual person will be caught up in a mass shooting. But for some of these young Black men in these impoverished neighborhoods, the likelihood that they will be caught up in gun violence is far higher. So I think that the efforts we need to take basically is we need to recognize that our political capital is limited, that we can't address every issue all at once. And so what we should do is to essentially get the most bang for our buck and have policies that will save the most lives with the least amount of capital expenditure, political capital, as well as economic, but I'm thinking more of the political here. And so what that means is we need to address the problem of homicides that young Black men face in poor inner cities. We need to address the domestic violence that is primarily Black women and Native American women face. And we also need to address something that gets a bit less attention, although there have been some efforts to do so. We need to address the suicide problem that is more middle-aged white men in the West, Midwest. And so I think all of those issues, the best way that I've seen to address the issue of violence that affects young Black men is to intervene directly, targeted intervention in those communities. There's a statistic that says that there are, in some cities, there's a group of about 500 or 1,000 young Black men that, among whom 50% of the homicides in that city are going to occur. And the policymakers know about this, or at least they can easily figure out who those men are. And so there's something called Operation Ceasefire that was started, I believe, in Boston, where they basically have community interventions, and they basically bring these young men into a meeting with mentors, with advocates, to see if they can figure out ways to get them out of the life, or at least to calm down the tensions that they have. And they saw with relatively minimal expenditures and no confiscation of firearms or banning of any particular weapons, which obviously, as we know, is controversial, they saw decreases of something like 15, 20% in just a couple of years in the number of homicides that occur. So I think that just gives a flavor. I could probably talk about this for another 10, 15 minutes, but that gives a flavor, I think, of where I think the conversation should be focused on evidence-based ways to mitigate the risk of gun violence, where it's actually where the risk is actually highest. And then we also have to consider just the pragmatic aspect of, there are calls to ban certain weapons or to have buybacks, and just the question that comes to my mind is how do we actually accomplish that when we have somewhere between 300 to 400 million firearms in private hands? If we get half of them, it's still far more firearms per person than any other country has in the world. And so I think that and the cost would be enormous. So I think that we need to target our interventions where they'll do the most good, and as well where they will be politically feasible. Pragmatic.
All right, thank you for that answer, Mr. Perkins. And now I do see that we have a number of additional viewers, both on our Zoom conference as well as on Facebook Live. So I do want to reiterate, so if you are on Zoom, you will see on the bottom of your screen a Q&A section. So if you type in your question on that interface, we will be sure to answer those questions in the order they are received. Also, if you are on our Facebook Live feed, we will do our best to answer your questions as well. Please do just realize, however, that your Facebook Live feed does have a 15-second delay. So we're moving on to our fourth question of the evening. This question comes to you from Illinois, from Ms. Bonnie Callis. The question is, would you advocate for legislation calling for paid maternity leave? Again, the question is, would you advocate for legislation calling for paid maternity leave?
Yes, I would. Absolutely. I think that there's a statistic that is brought up often when we talk about leave in general, which is that the United States is the only country, only developed country that doesn't require employers to offer paid leave. And so I think that generally speaking, there should be paid leave offered to employees in this country. And I think especially for mothers, as well as new fathers, there should be provisions made to make the transition into parenthood or to having more than one child, make that easier, and as well for women especially, they have to recover from the birth. Um, if they had a natural birth, there's a recovery period. If they've had a cesarean section, it's an even longer one. And so I think that it would definitely alleviate a lot of the burden that especially lower income families face. And as well, it would help reduce the felt need for abortions. Again, to go back to that, because a lot of women, they are worried about losing their jobs and then losing their jobs, losing their cars, their houses, not being able to put a roof over their heads, provide for themselves and their families. And so I think if we can provide supports, including paid maternity leave, then we would be able to help people make the choice to keep their children and to raise them.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. So now we will move to our questions on Facebook Live before we jump back into our question and answers from Zoom. This first question comes to you from Mr. Bob Moorhead. A young diabetic man recently died because he went to cheap insulin to try and pay for his wedding. Is it finally time to get aggressive with American healthcare? So again, the question is, a young diabetic man recently died because he went to cheap insulin to try and pay for his wedding. Is it finally time to get aggressive with American healthcare?
Oh, absolutely it is. I think that the healthcare system is one of I think we all know it. I think the voters in every election cycle, it's one of the top 3 or 5 priorities that they have is getting better healthcare, making sure it's more affordable, as well as stay high quality. And I think that is quite important. I mean, it's literally a matter of life or death in many cases, as with this young man's tragic story. I think that there needs to be multifaceted approaches to this. We need to. My opinion, I haven't yet settled on a particular plan. I do think there definitely needs to be more government intervention. I believe that we have seen in the past several decades that the free market is not sufficient to provide quality, affordable health care. There are numerous problems, as we all know. I'm sure we're all aware of them. And not least of which is the inability to afford coverage that can lead to further illness or even death. And so I think that universal coverage is something that needs to be implemented as soon as possible. That prescription drug prices and other medicine prices need to be controlled. That we can't have the Martin Shkreli is the so-called farmer bro who raised the price by hundreds of percent, or I think it was actually 7,000% of a drug that was actually still generic, but they were the only ones who were actually manufacturing it when he took over his company. So that sort of price gouging is just with medication that people need to live I find it heinous, and it needs to stop. So I think that I've looked into a bit into some of the European models. I think the German model, the Bismarck model, is a pretty good one. Something we should definitely look at, investigate whether it would work in our society. But as far as healthcare goes, whether it's the Bismarck model or another model, something like the NHS, Britain, or Canada's model, we do need to do something to make sure we have universal healthcare access that is truly accessible and affordable.
All right, thank you for that answer, Mr. Perkins. So let's move on back to our Zoom questions. So this next question comes to you again from Ms. Bonnie Callis. Their question is, what would be the 3 top priorities for your administration? And the question is, what would be the 3 top priorities for your administration?
I think obviously abortion is the top issue in my mind. And so the holistic approach that I mentioned earlier, where we provide support for the women and families who need it, as well as criminalizing the procedure when performed by a third party. I think that the issue of gun violence is becoming more and more salient to the national conversation, and people are very concerned about it. And I do think, as I mentioned before, some of the focus is misguided, but there's definitely an issue that needs to be addressed. And so I think addressing that would be another of my priorities. And then that's actually very convenient. We've talked about all three of the healthcare would be, I think, the other one, where we have people literally dying because they can't afford basic medicines. We need to remedy that situation and provide for our citizens.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. This next question comes to you from Mr. Matt Barco. Mr. Barco asks, how can we reduce the number of suicide attempts in this country? Question again is, how can we reduce the number of suicide attempts in this country?
I was looking at an interesting article the other day, and it talked about how so suicide attempts are largely done with firearms, at least successful ones. I believe it's somewhere around 2/3 of successful suicide attempts are done using firearms. And so the blog post was more about firearms and the violence associated with them overall. But I think since suicides comprise somewhere around 2/3 of those gun deaths, I think that it's quite salient. He talked about how restricting particular types of ammunition or particular types of firearms or accessories would potentially have a small impact, but what he found to have a very large associated effect was increasing, I believe, the Gini coefficient, which is essentially a measure of income inequality. And so if we have less income inequality, if the society is seen as more fair, as well as people being less likely to be desperate economically or otherwise, then the suicides would most likely decrease, because a lot of suicide, some of it is obviously mental illness. And so I think the push toward universal healthcare coverage will hopefully help with that. People will be able to get in, see counselors, psychiatrists, get the help they need. Some of it is desperation as well. Some of it is people who don't see any other way out of the situation they're in. And that sort of thing could be alleviated by reducing the income inequality in this country and making it a more equitable system where people have a better chance at what we historically call the American dream, reaching that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. This next question comes to you from your wife, Ms. Jocelyn Perkins. So this question is, do you think the federal government should encourage better maternity/paternity leave? If so, how? Again, the question is, do you think the federal government should encourage better maternity/paternity leave? And if so, how?
I do, definitely. And not merely because we've had 4 children and, it would be helpful for us personally. I think that, as I mentioned, the paid leave helps families to care for their children, helps them to keep their children. And so I think that the way to encourage that is by mandating it. And so whether that's by company, I know there's concern about small businesses especially, or whether that's by some sort of general fund that, similar to unemployment insurance, that people pay into, that would be used for paid leave. Whichever way, I think that we do need to provide it, and we do need to guarantee it to new mothers and fathers.
All right, thanks, Mr. Perkins. So we're heading back to our Facebook Live feed for additional questions. This next question comes again from Mr. Bob Moorhead. So Mr. Moorhead asks, Northeast Ohio last week suffered 2 instances of white power racial violence within a scant 18 hours. How would your administration heal the festering racial wounds in the United States? Again, the question is, Northeast Ohio last week suffered 2 instances of white power racial violence within a scant 18 hours. How would your administration heal the festering racial wounds in the United States?
So I think I think the first step toward that is what Ta-Nehisi Coates talked about in his landmark essay, The Case for Reparations, which is not actually so much about reparations themselves as we classically think of them, but as he said in there, by reparations, what he means is a full reckoning or accounting with what the way our country has treated Black and brown people and the ramifications of that we still see today, and the way that is still playing out in terms of systemic racism and other inequalities. And so I think that's the only way that we can heal the wound is to have something somewhat similar to the Truth and Reconciliation mission that they had in South Africa, where we bring all of these problems, all of these issues, all of these atrocities out into the light. We talk about them. We acknowledge what our country has done and has not done for or against people of color. And then once we've had that discussion, then whether there's any type of monetary reparations or other policies, that is something that would be addressed at that time. But the first step is to talk about it, to recognize. I mean, I think that's perhaps I think the most difficult part of it is to get people to realize or to recognize and acknowledge that systemic racism is still happening, and that the fact that slavery was abolished 150 years ago, that the Civil Rights Act was passed 50 years ago, and that we had a Black president, none of those facts means that racism is dead, and that the race issue is dead, and we should all just, as I've seen multiple people say, we just need to stop talking about race, and then the problem will go away. That's the opposite of what we should do. We need to talk more about it, more honestly, more openly, with more vulnerability.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. So this next question comes to you from Mr. or Ms. Grady. We just have a first initial, so we do not know who that is. However, the question is, there's a lot of debate about the Electoral College. What is your opinion? Again, the question is, there's a lot of debate about the Electoral College. What is your opinion?
I think that the Electoral College itself is not so problematic. I think the other pieces of our electoral system are what really need to be remedied. So the issues I see as being most important to address in that regard are partisan gerrymandering, and this is not really in particular. Partisan gerrymandering, where if you can draw a district that's essentially safe, but that's not good for political discourse. It leads to more polarization, more extremism, I believe. So that sort of thing, and also it's not fair to the voters, who may favor. I think that there's a state in the East, I think maybe Delaware, where the gerrymandering was so severe that more than 50% of the people in the state voted for Democratic lawmakers at the state legislature, but more than 50% of them turned out to be Republican because of the way that the districts were drawn. So that sort of thing, it just, it subverts the will of the people. It's just patently unfair. Another thing that we need to address is ballot access. The fact that the Republicans and Democrats hold such a stranglehold on the political process is due in large part, I believe, to the fact that they have managed to write the laws over the last 100, 200 years to keep themselves in power and to keep competition from coming up. And I think that the thought, it may not be conscious, but I think the thought is often, well, it's too bad that a Democrat or a Republican, too bad that a member of the other party won, but at least, we have another chance in 2 or 4 years. I think that they're concerned that the emergence of third parties, or excuse me, of other parties, might weaken their influence in the political landscape. And then the third issue that is crucial to having better election outcomes is changing the voting system. The first past the post method, which essentially says that whoever gets the most votes wins. and we only get to vote for one person, is also leading to polarization. It doesn't allow for representation of minority viewpoints at all. And so I think placing that with some sort of, depending on the race, approval voting, ranked choice voting, there's a number of different methods that are far better at actually reflecting people's preferences than first past the post, which is pretty lousy. So I think if we enacted those reforms nationwide, and if we had electoral college votes allocated by, say, congressional district, the way that Nebraska does, I believe. I think Maine has a somewhat similar system. But if we elected the electoral college votes by congressional district instead of winner take all for the state, I think that would lead as well to candidates having to appeal to a broader swath of the country instead of focusing on 3 to 7 swing states that they're concerned about winning, and virtually ignoring the rest of the people, unless it's to gin up energy from their base. So I think the electoral college itself is not the biggest problem. I think that it's there are other aspects of the system that are much more urgent to fix.
All right, thank you for that response, Mr. Perkins. All right, and then to the new viewers who are joining on Zoom and on Facebook Live, we just want to inform you again that if you're on Zoom, you can look to the bottom of your screen, and there is a function called Q&A. If you type your question into the Q&A user interface, then we will be able to answer those questions in the order they are received. And also, if you are on Facebook Live, you can type that into the comment box, and we will answer those to the best of our abilities when we review those as well. So please do keep in mind that the Facebook Live feed does have a 15-second delay, so we will not be able to answer those questions as immediate as if you were asking those questions on the Zoom feed. So with that, we'll continue on to our next question. And this question comes to you from Mr. Matthew Barco. And Mr. Barco asks, how much should we sacrifice to slow climate change? Again, the question is, how much should we sacrifice in order to slow climate change?
That's a good question. I think that how much should we sacrifice? The answer is a significant amount, potentially. But I think, again, this is one of the topics where pragmatism and political feasibility are, I think, more not quite as focused on as much as they should be. So the thing I've mentioned before when talking about this issue is that when we talk about reducing emissions, which is a worthy goal, we should definitely pollute the earth as little as possible. When we talk about reducing emissions, we're talking about fairly modest cuts because that's what's politically feasible. But the thing that I think is ignored sometimes is the fact that there are potentially hundreds of millions of people in, especially India and China, these developing countries, where these people don't currently have the means to consume a lot of carbon. They're living in, potentially huts with no running water, with no electricity, and without any vehicles. And so, if we are actually going to cut emissions significantly, then one of the things we would, I think, have to do is to stop those people from having the better life that we consider to be a minimal standard of living. Say, well, I understand you live in a subtropical region of India, but the planet needs you to not have air conditioning, or to not get a car or other vehicle for transportation. I think that sort of thinking is not going to work. I don't think it even should. I think that asking those people to sacrifice for the problems that the developed world has caused primarily is unjust, and that I don't think it'll be feasible for the developed world to cut emissions enough to actually reverse climate change. So I think that we need to look for more radical solutions. I mean, one thing that I do think should be thought about more, and I know there's a bit of controversy, of course, in the public, especially after the Fukushima Daiichi reactor meltdown. But I think the nuclear power is something that we should be considering a lot more seriously, especially since we can mitigate risks. Hopefully, we can mitigate some of the risks from a nuclear reactor failure. But we can't if we keep consuming coal and natural gas to fuel our or to power our countries and our societies. That's the sort of risk we can't mitigate against if we continue on this path. I think nuclear energy is one aspect of the solution. I think that we need to look at alternate forms of energy. Solar power and wind power, of course, are quite commonly spoken of. Wave generation is another thing we should consider. I think if we could get that, that would obviously be potentially very helpful, because obviously there are waves crashing onto the shores, coasts all around the world, potentially hundreds and hundreds of thousands, thousands and thousands of miles of shoreline where we could install generation machines. But I know there are a lot of technical difficulties with that. And another, I'd say, perhaps the most radical idea that I think we should focus on, because it also has the potential to be the most effective, is geoengineering. And what that basically means is to do something on a worldwide scale that would reduce the amount of sunlight that reaches the Earth by a small fraction. Not enough that you would notice it or I would notice it, but enough, a few percentage points is all we need to stop global warming and to give us time, at least breathing space, to clean up the mess we made and to get it under better control. And so that sort of thing, there are seeding clouds, I think, is something people talk about, which, it sounds a bit risky to me, environmentally speaking. But one of the things that's most fascinating for its potential is the idea of putting a solar sail in between the Earth and the sun that would essentially block, as I said, 1-2% of the light from the sun reaching the Earth. And the thing about that is that it would be completely reversible at any point. So it would be maneuverable, obviously control it from Earth. And so if we found that there were unexpected consequences, we could potentially just move it out of the way a few hundred miles or a few thousand miles so that it would no longer be blocking that energy. But I think whether it's that particular solution or another one, I think that we need to look at all of the possible options and explore every avenue we can that's feasible to reverse climate change, so that we, our children and our children's children don't have to deal with these ever increasing difficulties.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. So now we'll be moving on to our next question. And this question comes to you from Ms. Bonnie Callis. And so her question is, how would you address poverty, particularly as it pertains to the inner city? And the question is, how would you address poverty, particularly as it pertains to the inner city?
So I think that it's obviously a complicated issue. I think that the best way to address poverty is ideally to give everyone meaningful and justly compensated work to do that accords with their interests and their skills. So I think that job training, education, investment in the inner cities, building factories, although of course there are concerns there with pollution and blight, but essentially investing in the inner cities, where we've moved away to the suburbs in the last 50 or more years. A lot of those jobs and obviously the housing moved out to the suburbs. So I think incentivizing employers and business owners and service providers to return to the inner cities while not displacing the residents who are there currently is the way to go. How precisely to do that is probably a little bit out of my wheelhouse. But I think tax incentives, other sorts of things, investments in schools, especially, because as I mentioned, education is one of the keys to being able to have productive work that's well compensated. And I think that our inner city schools and public schools in general, in many cases, are not funded nearly as well as they should be. And the educational quality we provide is often mediocre at best and abysmal at worst. And so I think those are some of the avenues I would pursue to help reduce poverty in inner cities.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. This next question comes from a Pastor Said or Pastor C. Ed. And his question is, what judicial philosophy would you look for if you had the opportunity to nominate a Supreme Court justice? Again, the question is, what judicial philosophy would you look for if you had the opportunity to nominate a Supreme Court justice?
Well, I think that I would not choose an originalist. I would not choose an activist. I think somewhere in the middle, someone who, I think that courts should serve the people. They should serve the society as a whole. And instead of staying with precedent as essentially gospel, or treating the supposed original meaning of the Constitution as gospel. But also, I do think that there is something to be said about restraint. I don't think that large social changes should be foisted upon the American people by the means of an unelected slate of 9 judges. I think we saw what happened in Roe versus Wade with that. And as I understand it, most of the justices thought that it was, this is the way the country was going. It wouldn't be a big issue. But now, almost 50 years later, we're still litigating it. It's still as contentious as ever. And so I think that there is a sense in which the judiciary needs to follow the will of the people. But I think there's perhaps the most important thing to me is a sense of justice, and a sense that the judiciary needs to enact, or not enact, but protect justice and protect the rights of citizens. And so that means striking down unjust laws, or making decisions that people might not necessarily agree with, if it's what's right. And so, long story short, I suppose the answer is I don't have a quick and easy answer for you. But I think it's someone who's committed to fairness, committed to equality and justice for all people.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. So now we are going to be moving back to our Facebook Live questions. And please do be aware, again, if you are tuning in from online on our Zoom application, you can type in your questions in that Q&A box, and we will answer those questions in the order they are received. Or if you are asking, or if you are attending our meeting via Facebook Live, you can type them into the comment box, and we will address those as well. This question comes to you from Mr. Bob Moorhead. And his question for you is, what is your opinion on the idea of universal basic income? Again, the question is, what is your opinion on the idea of universal basic income?
I find it intriguing. I think it's something we should certainly explore. I think that there's a program, I believe, in Stockton, California currently that is testing it on a limited scale. I think that expanding that, or at least having it perhaps in multiple locations with different population types, different selection types, different sizes of the people, the pool of people who are going to get the universal basic income. I think all those things are worth doing, because I don't think we have enough information yet on the effects of it, on whether what the naysayers say, or what the its most ardent supporters say, which of those will turn out to be correct, or will it be somewhere in the middle? So I think research on that is something we should definitely invest in across the country. I do believe, however, whether it's through universal basic income or through a negative income tax, which was floated and almost passed, pretty close during the Nixon administration, I believe that there should be some sort of income floor for the households in our country. That there shouldn't be a, we have the ability to provide the basic needs for everyone in our society, and so we should do so. And so that income floor, as far as the exact level, that's obviously something that would, again, need more research. But I think that it should be a level where people aren't having to desperately seek out provisions, having to rely on charity or hope that they qualify for whatever sort of aid they can get in order to keep a roof over their families' heads and put food on the table. I think that we should provide that security, that economic security for all households in this country. And so again, the exact method needs more study, but the principle of an income floor is something I'm most certainly for.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. And so this next question comes to you from Ms. Sarah Field of Indiana. Ms. Field asks, do you have any solutions to propose for the opioid crisis? Again, Ms. Field's question is, do you have any solutions to propose for the opioid crisis?
I think it's in many respects similar to other drug crises that we've had, where one of the things that we need to do is to remove the fear of imprisonment for people who are addicted. I think that prevents a lot of people from seeking help, is the fear that if they are caught using, or if they admit that they need it, that they have this addiction, that they could potentially face civil or criminal penalties for it, and that just drives them into the shadows and keeps them from getting the help they need. And so I think that would be the first thing I would say, is to whether it's some sort of amnesty or whether it's to decriminalize, obtaining these medications without a prescription. But I do think that there do need to be, I think the recent spate of lawsuits against these pharmaceutical companies that have provided hundreds of millions of these pills, billions of these pills to American consumers without fully disclosing the potential addictive effects to them or to their doctors. I think that's just outlandish, and it's something that needs to be addressed through both civil and potentially criminal penalties against those companies and their executives. And then, as far as how to actually go about addressing the particular issue of people becoming addicted and then remaining addicted and then potentially overdosing and dying, or losing jobs, families over this problem, the answer is more treatment, more access to both inpatient and outpatient rehabilitation programs, and making it fully accessible. I've heard a story recently about how there's a program, I can't remember exactly where, but they have something like 120 spots, and they have waiting lists that's several months long. And in this community, there's not any other option. It's a rural community, as I recall. And so I think we need to expand, we need to focus where the issue is most extreme. I think we can see some of that by looking at the distribution of these prescriptions. I think that'll help us target our efforts where they can do the most good. And then even in these rural areas, we need to get doctors there, to get programs there, set up with all the facilities that they need to help these people, to get them off of these drugs and back into society.
All right, thank you again, Mr. Perkins. So now we're going to be turning back to our questions from Zoom. This next question comes from Ms. Ruth Powers. And Ms. Powers asks, my question deals with agriculture. What would your response be to farmers who are suffering significant losses, such as is the case with the current Mississippi River flooding? Again, this question is from Ms. Ruth Powers. Her question is, my question deals with agriculture. What would be your response to farmers who are suffering significant losses, such as is the case with the current Mississippi River flooding?
I think the insurance programs for farmers and the aid programs for farmers definitely need to be retained and expanded. It's one of the most important jobs in the United States. It certainly gets a lot less attention than a lot of other jobs that are more flashier, finance, the law. But I think that farmers raise our crops and animals that we eat, and so our food depends on them. And obviously, food is one of the basic necessities of life. So I think that we need to recognize that and grant them the respect they deserve. And then we also need to acknowledge we talk about acts of God very generally in the insurance industry. Just an act of God isn't something you can predict. But farmers are far more subject to the whims of nature, and as Ms. Powers mentioned, the flooding, other types of natural disasters, hurricanes, droughts, over significant rains over what people expect, damage crops, hail, pests. So all these sorts of things are very difficult for the individual farmer to hedge against. And so I think that the society as a whole, through the government, should be helping farmers with that by potentially, I'm thinking, some sort of risk pool that could be accessed. Similar to how we do FEMA nowadays for natural disasters in cities, and as well, I know they do assist farmers sometimes in rural areas, but we see it mostly in cities like in New Orleans after Katrina, and Houston after Harvey. I think that something similar to that, or perhaps expanding FEMA's purview to include these sorts of natural disasters that affect farmers, and perhaps compensate them more generously. Because I think another issue, we may be getting a bit into the weeds here, but with farming is that since the individual farmer, it's difficult for him to hedge against risk. That leads to more agribusiness coming in, factory farms, these very large-scale operations that we've seen are not as good for the environment, not as good for the animals that are raised there, and not as good for the community. And so we have these farmers that are losing their livelihoods, selling their farms to this large operation. And so it's not the only people who profit from that really are the executives of agribusiness, their shareholders, and their lobbyists, I suppose. And so I think that if we provide a bit more of a safety net for individual farmers, family farmers, or small co-ops, then we'll be able to keep more farms in the hands of fewer people, or I meant to say not the hands of fewer people, because that's what agribusiness does. So keep more farms as smaller operations that are owned by just a family or two or a single person, rather than these large conglomerates that are causing so much trouble for agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. So this next question is related. It comes from Mr. Matthew Barco. But if there's anything you could add to this, Mr. Barco asks, how would your administration address the concerns of rural America? And how would your administration address the concerns of rural America?
I think the first step is, as I mentioned with farmers, respecting these people. I think there's a lot of, not just in the media as well as in politics in general, there's a tendency to dismiss people who don't live in cities or suburbs as rednecks, backwater, hillbillies, or other derogatory terms. And I think that sort of disrespect is just contributing to the types of divisions we see in our society. So I think the first step is to truly respect them, to show that respect to them as well as to show everyone watching that my administration does respect rural America as much as we respect urban America, suburban America. These are people, these are American citizens. They have their own concerns that are more specific to where they live, but they're not any less valuable or any less valuable. Their concerns, and the people aren't less valuable. And so I think that one good idea might be to, one possible idea would be to, some politicians will have listening tours where they'll visit a small town for an afternoon, have a town hall maybe, or sit down at the local cafe and talk to people, shake hands. But they, at the end of that, they go back to Washington or to the state capitol, wherever. And often I'm sure rural people can feel condescended to, patronized by that sort of thing. So I think that making sure that their concerns are addressed, perhaps some sort of liaison or commission or someone appointed specifically for the purpose of bringing those concerns that can more easily be dismissed by people who don't live in the country, bringing those concerns up, making sure that we address them. I mean, I think it's what solidarity is about. It's what the preferential option for the poor is about. We need to make sure that all of our proposals for policies, for legislation, address or are that we always consider those who are least able to get our attention, those who we're least likely to naturally think about. And so that's why I think addressing the problems of young Black men with regard to gun violence is so important, because it's so easy for people who don't live in the inner cities of these large cities to just pay lip service to, maybe, but not really do anything about it. But when we have a mass shooting where a white man goes to some suburban place and kills a lot of other people who are more like us, we pay more attention, even though these young Black men are dying at a far higher rate. We're just ignoring them. I think similarly with the poor in general, we don't care as much about their concerns. We might volunteer at a soup kitchen on Thanksgiving, but as far as actually serving them and having policies that are truly going to help them, even if it somewhat lessens the advantage that those in the middle class and upper class have, politicians aren't too interested in that. And so the same goes for rural America. We don't, city dwellers don't tend to consider the concerns of these people who live in the country as being all that important. And you'll often hear, I've heard before, why don't they just move to a city? There's more opportunity there. They can have a better life. Not realizing, I'm apparently, that, first of all, for a lot of these people, this is where they've grown up. This is the community they know. They might not have resources to move. They might have family nearby where they live and not be willing or able to move away from them. And they might not have the education or skills necessary to be as successful in the city because their rural community was underserved and they weren't able to obtain that during the earlier years. So I think that, yeah, we do need to do a great deal more for the rural people of America and bring a lot more attention to their particular issues and concerns.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. All right, so we have a question from Mr. Timothy Trewin. I believe Mr. Trewin is in Florida, great state of Florida. Mr. Trewin asks, pick a foreign nation and describe how you might change policy towards that nation. Again, Mr. Trewin asks, pick a foreign nation and describe how you might change policy towards that nation.
The one that comes to mind as most significant in my mind is something, and this is both Democrats and Republicans are guilty of this over the past 2 decades or more, is China. The government there is totalitarian, can be brutal at times, oppresses its people, and yet we essentially overlook that completely. I mean, there's currently, this whole tariff issue the current administration is engaging in, which I find to be a bit beside the point. So I think I would definitely be wanting to impose sanctions or some sort of pressure on them to be more humanitarian to their people, be more humane to them, to treat them with the respect they deserve as human beings. And so while it's possible that there would be a similar toughness, as it were, with respect to China, it would be for a completely different reason than the current administration has, and in a different way. I think that the fact that we have China's become our largest trading partner, and they've just been essentially accepted into the international community without much, if anything, being done about the humanitarian issues that their people face, is a travesty. One of the most egregious foreign relations stumbles of the past few decades.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. So we are at the end of our stated questions by our viewers. So viewers, this will be your last opportunity if you want to ask a question on Zoom, either via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or if you are watching on Facebook Live by typing into the comment field. We will address those questions as they come in. So in the absence of those questions, Mr. Perkins, I'd like to ask you a personal question of my own. And that question is, I've heard that you were, once upon a time, a contestant on the game show Jeopardy. And that show has a very particular format. So what I would like to ask you is, if there's one question you would like to ask the American voter this electoral season, what would be that question?
I think my question would be, are you truly satisfied with the choices you have before you? And do you believe that they really reflect your values and your beliefs? I think most people would say, not really, but it's the best we've got. I think those are the people that we need to reach to make them aware that there is an alternative out there, not just the American Solidarity Party, but that the idea that they have to choose between Republicans and Democrats, and that's the only options they have. But that's a false choice that those two major parties have forced them into intentionally, structurally, over the past century and more. And so I think that would be my question: is are you satisfied with the choices you have, and do you believe that they reflect your values and your beliefs? And I think the answer is, for most of us, no. And so hopefully we can provide a better option and a vision for a future in which you could actually vote for someone, not have to hold your nose, but be satisfied with the choice you made when you cast your vote.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. We do not have any further questions, so we will adjourn this evening. We thank you so much for your time and for joining us. And again, for all you viewers who may not be part of the American Solidarity Party, we do ask you to check us out. You can find us at www.solidarity-party.org online, or you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @amsolidarity. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we will adjourn at this time. Thank you again.
Thank you, Tai-Chi.